Today's guest, Dr. Alexander Insam from GÖRG.
We like to talk about the change, but nobody likes to experience the change. On the other hand, it's a huge opportunity. We need to build new technologies. We need green tech. We need new technologies for renewable energy. We need new technologies to come up with certain answers for the future. So we need the innovation. We need people to focus on the innovation, not to focus on their fears. And now bring this together. If we had a more liberal legal system where people are allowed to work like they want, and companies incentivize people according to the future value of the work, giving more shares and stock options, letting people participate in what they create. So we need to harness the innovation. And that's the opportunity we have. When we get the cycle right, when we get people motivated and incentivized to focus on the innovation power, to focus on what they can bring to the table, to promoting them even when they work part-time, then I think we can master the change, because the challenge is the same for everybody. It's not a German challenge or an Austrian challenge or a French challenge. It's a worldwide challenge.
Alexander and I talked about 3 areas in the podcast. One area was his passion and also my passion, watches, mechanical watches. So if you don't like watches, then skip the first 15 to 20 minutes. Then we talked about remuneration, compensation overall, and how incentivization drives behavior, and also how we can solve the climate change problem or crises in general through remuneration, and also how the legal system in Germany is designed more towards a blue-collar approach versus what we would need now to solve many problems. So this episode was a really diverse one in topics we covered. So I would really encourage you to listen to it, because I think it gives a very broad and different perspective to certain day-to-day topics.
Then you can build trust, and then you can spend less time communicating and more time just getting shit done.
Then I went home and thought about this sentence.
We basically put it on the table.
Hiring takes time. People are trained.
How to objectively judge certain situations.
It's very hard to change things.
That was the learning.
Entrepreneurs with
To
empathy.
the people side.
Hello Alexander, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So maybe we start with a short introduction. So can you tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Alexander Insam. I'm actually living in Seeheim, which is near Darmstadt, or Frankfurt as the bigger town. I'm a father of 2. I got a 17-year-old daughter, Sophia, and a 3-year-old boy, Jason. And they are keeping me quite busy. And apart from that, I'm working as a lawyer and partner in Frankfurt. I specialize in employment and labor law. I also do remuneration law for banks, and I'm a mediator. I studied law at the University of Heidelberg some years ago, and then I went to Frankfurt to started working as a lawyer, and this is a lot of fun. So it's been keeping me busy until this date.
And you also said you have a passion for assembling watches.
Well, assembling watches is probably too far-fetched, but I have a passion for mechanical watches. That's right. So I think it's always when you have some spare time, and I like a lot of reading. I've always been a reader, and I fell in love actually with watch books, because they show how the watches are assembled, how they are made, and I think it's really interesting to see that a watch is basically some kind of art, it's art on the wrist. So uh, when you compare a mechanical watch to a quartz watch, and you see how many different pieces there are in a watch, and how a watchmaker has to come up with ideas to not only show the time but the date, or an annual calendar, or even a perpetual calendar, and you see those many hundred parts inside a watch and how tiny they are, and the craft making that goes into a watch, the Handwerkskunst as we call it in German. Well, this is really fascinating for me. So I started reading about watches. I started buying some watches too, and whenever I go to work, a watch is on my wrist, and I can fully enjoy it.
And what are your favorite models?
Well, I actually I think there's from all the big maisons there's a story behind them, and I like to read the stories. So, for instance, one of my first watches was from Chopin, and Chopin is actually a German watch manufacturer now, because back in the last century, when they had financial problems, a German family, the family Schäufele, bought them. And after the quartz crisis, so what's kind of interesting in the watch industry is there was a time before and after the quartz crisis. So in the 1970s, watches became very cheap through the invention of quartz, and then all the big maisons, they first had huge problems. They didn't have any more customers. The customers turned to the cheap quartz watches, and then they started um, getting back on their feet. And one of the maisons is Chopard. It's very innovative, and they also revived the second brand, Ferdinand Berthoud, which is one of the brands sometimes carry the names of very old and famous watchmakers, and they have a great passion for the craftsmanship. But there are so many. I mean, as a German guy, A. Lange and Söhne, of course, and all of Glashütte and Dresden is a big center. You have the famous Swiss names like Vacheron Constantin, Jaeger-LeCoultre. But what I also like is the independent watchmakers. So, for instance, MB&F, which stands for Max Büsser and Friends. I think those are great guys, because they kind of reset the scene. Max Büsser used to be with Jaeger-LeCoultre and Harry Winston, and then he founded his own label, and he called it Max Büsser and Friends, because he wanted to work with his friends, which I think is a great idea. And they started to make watches even more as art objectives, as horological machines. So they kind of look very unusual, and it's fascinating how it reinvigorated the scene. And actually, the COVID crisis helped the watch industry a lot. So the last 3 years have been the most successful years in the watch industry as of recent, because I think people were a little bored. They couldn't travel. They had a lot of money to spend, and they discovered that watches are kind of a global trade object. It's the art on the wrist, and you can carry, like the big painting you used to have in your living room. You can't carry it around. When I look in your background, I see a painting on the right side where you can't take it off and bring it with you. But a watch is
Yeah.
different. You can carry 3 or 4 watches always with you. So I really like the independent watchmakers. A lot of young watchmakers that are now entering the scene. So when you start playing the watch game, you first start with probably everybody like knows Rolex and Patek Philippe, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. Then you discover, okay, there are like 50, 100 maisons with a huge history. Gisbert Brunner, who's one of the most famous journalists, a German guy who wrote a lot of books. He just wrote a book about Oris, which is a not well-known name, but has a over 100-year history. And
So that's a journalist writing about watch companies and watches?
yeah. There are many journalists now specializing on watches and watch stories. And I mean, probably the most famous is Hodinkee. So Hodinkee, when you go to the website, they started writing about watches. They actually started like producing podcasts and shows. Or Teddy Baldessari, he's a guy from Canada. He's all on YouTube, and he does watch videos, and it's kind of interesting because people tell stories about watches when they acquired them in different circumstances. So, for instance, when I left KPMG after 13 years, and this was like a huge moment in my life because I've been so long at KPMG. I made partner there in 2010. I'd been a partner for 10 years, and then I decided to join a German law firm, and I wanted to celebrate this moment. I have something that reminds me of KPMG. So KPMG, the corporate color is blue. I always joked about having blue blood. So actually, the watch I brought today, and which is the watch I bought together with my wife after leaving KPMG, is from Vacheron and Constantin, and it's the Overseas, and it has a very
Nice watch.
blue lacquered dial, and it's
Was it easier to get one? Because I also have the same story to my first watch. So for me, it was really hard to get my first watch. It was also a Rolex, but it was in the time, I think, post-COVID, during COVID. So in that time, so 2-3 years ago. And for me, it was really hard to get one. I waited around, I think, a year or 6 months plus, and then suddenly out of nowhere, I got one. Do you know why?
So the at the big so Rolex has always been faming for having waiting lists. This is not new to Rolex because they're producing a lot of watches, so they are actually producing more than 1 million watches a year. They have special models, especially the steel ones, that are very much in demand and where you have a wait list. This is not uncommon. And Rolex also has a special deal with the shops because they always need to have the Rolex in stock, but they're not allowed to sell it. So you go to a shop window, you see the Rolex, you can try it on, but you cannot buy it because in order to buy it, you need to have a second or a third one in shop, and that won't happen. Rolex is in such huge demand worldwide because it is so well known. I don't think they make the best watches from an art and quality point of view, but from a branding point of view, Rolex are the most famous ones, absolutely, and they have the highest value apart from Patek Philippe on the gray market. But other watch companies are catching up, and for instance, Audemars Piguet or also Vacheron and Constantin, they have models like the Royal Oak or the Overseas that became very much in demand. So I was lucky. I was on a wait list for this, but I got it through I think after 2 or 3 months. I actually got it way faster than I expected to do, and then you have the trouble of, okay, we already have the money to buy it. But this is then the other part of the problem. But waiting lists have become a thing, and so my game today is more to look for brands and models that are probably not in such high demand because everybody wants them, but to find something special that I just want. Yeah, but it's interesting. And which Rolex do you have, Thomas?
It was just a very regular date just. So with
Oh,
a Jubilee band and I think platin dial. Yeah.
okay,
Be-
but
Because
I mean that's a very nice watch. So
no, it's a very nice watch, but I think it's also a very common Rolex, right? Then you still have maybe more the sporty ones like the Submariner, and yeah, this is also what people often have, right? But I wanted to go for something more classical a bit. And I think that's a very classical Rolex watch, isn't it?
Absolutely. And what's kind of interesting, so Rolex, I deliberately started with other brands because Rolex always has a closed case back, and I'm drawn to open case backs. So, for instance, when you flip the watch around and you take a look and you see all the beautiful stuff inside, you can only do it
Nice.
with an open case back, and Rolex always had a closed case back. But in the Watches and Wonders fair, which is a big fair once a year, now in Geneva, and they showed new models, and for the first time, they're bringing their famous Daytona. Probably you've heard of the Rolex Daytona.
Sure.
They now have a platinum version with an open case back for the first time.
Wow.
And they have a new model, a dress watch. I think it's called a 1908, and it replaces the Cellini, and it also has an open case back. And in their sister company, Tudor, they also started to have first models with an open case back. So they're catching up on the scene because the watch people they like open case backs, so you can admire actually what's inside the watch.
I definitely agree. So that's very beautiful. I'm not that far in advance yet, but I'm also into it. I really enjoyed. But I think I need maybe spend a bit more time in also researching and also take your tips and hints on who are the go-to journalists to just get started a bit more.
I mean, from if you're into Rolex, I think Gisbert Brunner, the German guy I just mentioned, he wrote excellent Rolex books. He's a big Rolex expert, and starting with Rolex has the benefit that you will find a lot of stories about the watches and what they do. So Ben Clymer, the guy who started Hodinkee, if they have famous YouTube videos with John Mayer, the singer, and he's also into Rolex watches and talks about this stuff, and it's kind of fun to watch to see the passion that's happening. But I would also encourage you to take a look at the independent brands. We have now very famous ones like FP Journe. You can't get an FP Journe watch anymore. He's become too famous. But also Laurent Ferrier, Debitoon. Those are names you don't find in shops very often. But when you start researching in the internet, you take a look in the community, you see how much passion in the watch. And I'm always impressed when the people share their knowledge. So when you see videos from Max Büsser and he talks about the creations and the watches, it's just wonderful because you see the ideas of the designer of creating something. And I was particularly impressed by a book of Denis Flagolet, who is the watchmaker behind Debitoon, which is basically horological magic, and you see all the people, and also if you're looking for journalists, you should probably think of Wei Ko, who started the Revolution magazine, and the Revolution magazine was or is kind of an unusual watch magazine. And when I first saw the guy, I couldn't believe he's a watch expert, but that's also quite interesting about the watch scene. It's not all people like me are actually more the exception, wearing a suit. But it's a very diverse and individual scene. So
Also, a lot of artists, right? Really
a lot
like
of
it, and also the
artists.
brands they want to have artists wear these watches.
Yes, absolutely, and you also have partnerships. So Vacheron and Constantin, for instance, they now partnered with the Louvre. And
Oh
you
wow!
see that the watch industry is starting to sponsor art events, which is kind of interesting because they're making so much money, they can now afford to help other artists, which I think is great. It's becoming a whole world, a universe around art, around sharing ideas, and What I also like is you can have very simple watches, so time-only watches, which only have like they basically only show you the hours and the minutes, or for instance, also the seconds. And then you can have very complicated watches, like with a perpetual calendar, with a tourbillon, and you see there are hundreds and hundreds of parts. But the time-only watches, I fell in love with so many because they are simple, they're beautiful, they're reduced to a certain message, and they have an elegance. And of course, when you're looking for a dress watch, you want a watch that can slide under the cuff. So you don't want a really big one, but you want a slimmer watch. So it's really really interesting. Apart from there being watches for anything you can imagine, sports, diving. You mentioned a Submariner earlier, which used to be dive watch. So in the
Yes.
in the last century, the big thing was to get a watch waterproof, so you could use it underwater. Actually, before we came to wristwatches, the watches we had clocks. And one of the first wristwatches actually was from Cartier, um, and they made it for pilot. Um, and then through the fighting in the world wars, World War One and World War Two, um, a lot of watch companies had to make watches for war because the soldiers needed watches. They had to time their attacks and their defenses, and how they would fight. And so, kind of sadly, the wristwatch became popular after the wars. So we had to go through wars to then become accustomed to wearing watches at work and in our leisure time. So
Interesting.
it's not that old actually. So the majority of wristwatches, or also vintage watches we're talking today, they're after World War II.
Wow, wow, wow. In case you like my show, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it. But let's dive a bit into your expertise as a lawyer. So, how can a company transform from a, let's say, GmbH into a SE or AG? Because I see this often happening, especially with startups that get a lot of funding and expand, that they becoming a European kind of entity. Can you tell us a bit more about your experience there and how you see it?
Yeah, so as a lawyer, I specialize in employment and labor law, which basically means whenever you want to employ people, you need to give them an employment contract, an employment agreement. In Germany, you have collective labor law, meaning you often have a works council and you do works agreements. You have trade unions, and you can do a collective agreement with them. And then you also have something that's called co-determination on the level. So we have a two-board system in Germany. So when you have a GmbH or an Aktiengesellschaft AG, you have a managing director or a member of the executive board who basically does the operational leadership. And then you have a supervisory board that's in the background. And the supervisory board represents the shareholders. And the shareholders don't influence the company directly, but through the supervisory board, they get to elect the managing directors or the executive board. And the question for a company, do I want to be a GmbH, an AG, or an SE? So whenever, because you mentioned this, the SE is a European corporate identity, and it was founded so you can take the point in time on a national level of co-determination and kind of freeze it. So many companies are afraid when they start as startups that they don't want the employees to sit on the supervisory board, which is mandatory in Germany when you grow larger than 500 employees as a GmbH or AG. or 2,000 employees, and then you have 1/3 or 50% of the employees sitting in the supervisory board. And in order to prevent that, you can transform the company into an SE and freeze actually the state of co-determination before the employees sit in the supervisory board. So this is one of the reasons. Another reason is that you can change the seat of the company through the European Union frequently. But this is normally what you would call corporate law. So I have my colleagues that advise on the corporate law side in order to, if you want to like change from a GmbH to an SE. So your corporate identity. I would make the contracts for the executive board members or the managing directors. So often the supervisory board comes to me and asks, okay, how much money should we pay them and how should we structure it? So normally you have a 2-component system. One component is fixed remuneration, where you basically pay a certain salary every month. And then you have a bonus component, variable remuneration. And there can be one bonus component, there can be 2 bonus components. So in big companies, it's, for instance, usually you get a short-term variable remuneration that says you get sort of a cash bonus at the end of the year, depending how well the year went. And then probably you have like a long-term component. You can also acquire shares or options to participate in the future earnings of the company. And this is especially true with startups. I mean, when we talk about startups, they at the beginning, they often struggle and they don't have enough money to hire the best people. But they want, of course, the best people to be a successful startup. So how do you solve this? And then they come up with ideas. Let's do a stock option plan or a virtual stock option plan, which is a little bit easier, because in a stock option plan, you also need to have the shares to give to your employees. In a virtual stock option
How does
plan,
this look like? That you would really already have to be an AG, or could you also do it as a GmbH? But it's harder to change GmbH ownership, isn't it?
So it often what you want to do as a startup is when you start as a GmbH, you're preparing when you're growing from an IPO. You want to be listed at a stock exchange, and then when you turn into an AG, you have shares, and then you get a share price and share value, and so some of the programs, they are already working towards the IPO. So when the company will get listed, and the way you do it legally is you provide the people with options. So like in the future, you get the right, Thomas, to buy my share in 3 years for €5. And of course, you hope when the share is like €10, you already doubled the value. And you can even take this one step further, which is quite common now, and you do a virtual stock option plan. It's called a VSOP, and you just say, okay, I get the right to buy the shares at a certain amount, but I will not actually execute the right, but I will resell it immediately to the company, and the company will pay me the difference. So you get the right to sell basically 10, 100, 1,000 shares at a certain price. And whenever the stock price is higher, you're going to make a profit.
That's interesting. So I did not also know it in that detail. So there are 3 different types then. First is that there are real options or real stock plans.
You
have
the real stock plans where you're already in an AG and you would immediately get the right to buy a share. And for instance, there are programs like like SAP did this also a few years ago. As an employee, you get one share. You buy one share and you get one for free. So you end up with 2 shares for the price of one. This is quite nice.
Yes. Yeah, especially SAP is doing well on the stock exchange as well. I
Yeah.
also have SAP stocks. I like
So
them.
yeah. So you buy shares at a reduced price, or you get free shares, and then you also participate in the future value of the shares, or you participate from the dividends. You can also build a portfolio and say, okay, I just have a lot of shares, and I take the dividends as my income.
What do you
So
think are the different in incentivation or the motivation behind the incentivation of the remuneration scheme of the different ones? Do you have also some ideas about that, also for maybe the whole company, but also for the executive teams? Because I think that's quite crucial on how you incentivize people. It is also highly determined how they act.
and for companies, especially startups, I just have a client. It's a big question is always, do I want to incentivize growth or profitability? Because they're two different things. Especially when you're starting as a company, you want to gain market share, you want to grow, you want to get more revenue. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're making profit. I mean, take a look at Amazon, for instance. They haven't been profitable for like 10, 15 years. So at the beginning, Amazon was not the giant it's today. It was just a company that was very, very good at getting more and more money in financing. Yeah, there were fundraisers to be able to grow to a size where they could start being profitable. But I think the way was like 10 or 12 years. So growth and market share is important for companies. On the
Also,
other hand,
Zalando had the same.
yeah, you first need to grow big, and then you're starting to make profits. But some companies
Similar
don't make
model. Exactly.
it. And then
And also they had a very similar model, right? E-commerce. And then at scale, things get cheaper.
yeah,
So you have this economies at scale. So
it
that makes sense.
and it's a bet into the future that you can get bigger than the competition, so the economies of scale then benefit you. So
Mm.
when you are working in a company that's just based on growth, if you are providing shares or stock options, it is also, yeah, you get the skin of the people in the game because they're very determined that you will not fail, because when you fail, well, your bonus is nothing worse. That's a difference from cash. When you get a lot of stock options and they have no value, you basically got no money. So it's good to incentivize growth because the people really have the skin in the game. On the other hand, it also depends on how risk averse people are. Some people just prefer to be encouraged by profit because they say, okay, I can measure that more clearly. Let's take the EBIT or the EBITDA, and we just see how much profit we make, and from the profit I'm able to pay you a nice cash bonus. I'm able to also give you some shares. A stock price will usually rise when you're making profit. So for instance, what I find quite interesting, the new strategy of Mercedes-Benz is no longer sell as many cars as you can do, but make more profit per car sold. And they have record profits in the books right now, which is good for the share price, which is good for people who hold shares. The different models, I think it's on the
How did you observe that? Did you check their annual or their quarterly earnings calls, or how do you
well, it's
become
in
aware
the
of that changes?
it's in the for Mercedes-Benz, it's in the press all over right now that they really managed to increase their margin. They're more turning towards a luxury strategy, so selling bigger cars, more expensive, but also the bigger, more expensive cars are cars where they have a larger profit margin. So instead of selling 100 cars, you can sell 20 cars and make just as much profit. It's a different strategy, but I mean when you take a look right now, the owner and chairman of LVMH, which is the biggest luxury company of the world.
Also, currently, I think the
Arnault,
richest man in the world, right?
he just became the richest man in the world. So because Elon Musk dropped a little bit, Jeff Bezos too, Bernard Arnault, he's now across 200 billion euros. I think the third guy to cross this threshold, which is a lot of money for one guy. He became very successful, and it's a game that's more on the profit side, the luxury game. But you can never tell. I mean, Amazon became big through the growth game, and so it's shifting back and forth. And it's the same with compensation systems. So there is not the one compensation system that's the best for everybody. So every company has to, in its life cycle, determine how do we manage our compensation system. When you are few employees, when you're a startup, you can also be very individual. You can have different employment agreements for everybody. You can say, okay, what is important for you, Thomas? What is important for you, Alexander? Let's do 2 different contracts. If you're having 1,000 people or 2,000 people, you will start thinking more in terms of HR processes and say, okay, we need different levels of compensation. We have probably a grading system. We have job titles. And not just because we fancy all this stuff, but because we need some sort of system to also have an operational HR and compensation system. We need a compensation strategy. We need, on the one hand, people be able to grow and to earn their living. But on the other hand, we also need a structure that is fit for the company, that allows people to enter and leave the company, for instance. That's when we get back to the to stock and stock option programs. One of the biggest questions is always, what happens when people leave the company? So when you have shares, are you able to keep the shares when you leave the company? Or are you then forced to sell them? What does the company want? What do you want? Is there a limited amount of shares, or can we raise the capital and issue more shares? But which will also mean to the existing shareholders that their individual shares are worth less. Also, with shares is usually get voting rights. So you not only participate in the economic profit of the company, but you also want to have an influence on the company, because through the shareholders assembly, you can vote, you can raise your voice, and you probably then you ask yourselves, okay, how many shares do I have? How many voting rights do I have? Is this important? Do I have friends I can team up with, and suddenly we have probably a majority in the voting? So those are all questions to keep in mind. A virtual stock option program just focuses on the economic side. You have no voting issues there. You don't need to worry how many shares you can issue. So it's different, but it's probably, in terms of motivation, incentivation, owning shares might be better to drive the company to the next level. It's,
Yes.
where you have to talk to people, have to find out what's the situation of the company in the market, what is the situation from a growth perspective, from a profit perspective, where do they want to be in 3 years, in 5 years. And what I often see is, I mean, many clients I have right now, so I'm working towards the next step in my life, which is becoming a white old man. I'm now 47. I'm now 20 years into the industry. I've been a lawyer for 20 years now, and I've been advising some clients for 10, 15, almost 20 years.
What
And
type of clients?
well, actually, it varies. So right now, I have, I'd say, about 50% of my clients are banks, and this is after 2008, after the financial crisis. We had new law, we had remuneration law, and I started heavily advising in the financial services and especially in the banking industry. But throughout my career and as a labor lawyer, you're actually it is quite rare that you have specific laws for industries. So I've been advising, for instance, a big retailer in Germany who has many supermarkets for basically my whole career, which is very interesting because banks and retail, totally different worlds. I'm advising a very innovative IT company, startups in biosciences. Um, I have automotive companies. So it's it's split across the industries, which is kind of interesting because you get to see a lot
Well,
of business models.
once I hired for a compensation team at
Mhm.
a client, a full team, right? Big growth trajectory, and they needed to set up the whole company to go public. And then when I was in the middle of the search for a, I think, director of compensation or total rewards, it was called, I also spoke to some lawyer profiles, also to some in-house profiles, and the first time there, I really got to know what's behind the surface of just a fixed sum and a bonus or a variable pay or long-term incentivation. And what I was um, really not shocked, but also not surprised. It was just it. I felt that was something different going on in the pharma industry in Switzerland when it comes to remuneration and compensation. There are bigger salaries, right? And also different schemes in terms of what you're used to on the market in Germany, for instance. Do you also see that? It's just
Um,
now a different topic, but this is stood
yeah,
in my mind.
yeah, and then you also, of course, have to take into account the cost of living.
Yeah.
So I think Switzerland and Germany, for instance, you will make more money in Switzerland, but it's also way more expensive to live in Switzerland when you compare if you want to rent an apartment or a house, and even if you go to the supermarket, you will get paid. For instance, when I see Zurich or Geneva, you almost have double the prices. You will get double the money, but you also have to pay double the prices. So
Yeah, true.
I don't know in the end if you're better up. For Austria, I'm not so sure if you earn more money in Austria and how the cost of living relates to that. I've always known for Switzerland, but what is your experience there?
Yeah, so I lived in Tirol and also in Vienna, so east
Hmm.
side, west side, and I think in the west you have a good level of Mittelstand, so that everybody earns okay, but also lives very well with it, because I think it's just a good economy and just a overall good situation through the tourism, and people just own properties. So they have a certain living standard with reasonable income, I would say. In Vienna, it's a very livable city, I would say. But if you are into using all the benefits of what is the rating of a livable city, like going with the U-Bahn. I don't like it, I don't take it, but okay, it's a very good infrastructure. So you could argue, if you like, go by public transport, that it's a very livable city, yes. And it's also very green and also not so expensive, because there is Wiener Wohnen. It's, I think, the biggest real estate supplier or owner in Europe, and they are owned mostly by the Vienna government, and they had politics who are very, very strongly driven by socialism post-war, and they had some majors who really shaped the city, and they came up with a law that you cannot go above a certain level of rent. And also Berlin wanted to implement that now and learn from Vienna, but they just could not, because Berlin sold everything in the early 2000s to US investors, and they don't get the property back now. And this is why housing is so crazy in Berlin. And I think for that, Vienna is very livable. And you can also, what I also see from a hiring perspective, the majority of entry level, mid level, maybe early senior positions where people have up to 5, 7, 8 years of experience, you can maybe even earn more in Vienna than in Berlin, and also have a better life because it's cheaper. But in Berlin, in Vienna, at some point you hit a ceiling, because the city is not that big, and also the industry there, I think there is no spike in a certain industry, right? In Berlin, you have the whole digital tech industry that is really or skyrocketed, and there you don't have a plateau. In Vienna, at some point you reach a plateau. When I do some director searches in Vienna, for instance, at 150,000 euro, usually it stops, and for senior profiles in engineering, for instance, it stops maybe at 90. And I think also in Berlin, or in a bigger market like maybe Paris or London, at some point you don't have a plateau, but you just go in different levels, and you see, okay, that level of seniority or speciality earns that level. And then you can go up to, I think the biggest salary I saw here was 600,000 euro we hired for. And that was quite a good salary, yeah. But also then at the same level, of an executive search, it was 300,000 euro. But then I compared it to the Zurich salary of a Roche candidate who was just at the director level, who would maybe earn 120, earned also 300. And I was like, okay, got it. In case you have any feedback or anything you want to share with me, please send me an email on thomas@peoplewise.com or hit me up on LinkedIn. And in case you really enjoy the show, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it.
So, but it seems to me then that Austria is way more comparable to Germany in the
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
cost of living than Switzerland, and then of
Yeah.
course the salaries are on a different level too. So yeah, and I also think, I mean, the compensation system, the major point right now is to combine the compensation system not only from a point of view employer attractivity, or how do you hire people, but also taking into account compensation systems help to get the climate change right. So the right compensation system, a green compensation system, will help us achieve the climate change. And why is that? Because people behave mainly according to what they can afford, what they get, and getting paid is important for them, and having money to spend, and how they spend it. So I think so throughout the European Union, we're having the EU taxonomy, and we're having laws that shall drive us towards climate change. ESG are probably it's the talk of the town right now. the environment, the social, and the governmental aspects that companies shall encourage. And how do they do this? They need to set up especially bonus systems and target agreements that will give you the right targets and say, okay, we want to steer the company towards a greener course. We want to make sure the products we're producing they are made from renewable energies. We will not pollute the environment, but we also need to take into account the social aspects. We want to have diverse companies. We want to give everybody a good shot at working. And I think, for instance, we're still right in the middle of giving men and women equal access to their careers. Where for the past years, I think, and again, it might be interesting to compare Germany to Austria to Switzerland. At least in Germany, we're still struggling at retaining enough qualified women to get the next step. So what we see frequently in companies is you have over 50% from the universities, women, well qualified, sometimes way better than men, joining companies. You see the talent pools in companies, over 50% women getting trained, getting ready for the next career step. And then you take a look at the first 2 or 3 levels, leadership levels in companies, and suddenly you see it's way below 50%.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting metrics behind this, where I think we're talking way too much about a pay gap, which I don't perceive as bad as it is written in the press.
Mhm.
What I think we should be talking more about is the promotion gap. The real problem behind
It's the root cause.
the pay gap is the promotions. We don't promote as many women, and when you take a certain span in our lives, let's say 25 to 40, from age 25 to 40, how many times is a man promoted in that period? And how many times is a woman promoted in that period? On average. And let's say the man is on average promoted every 3 years. So he gets promoted 5 times. How many times will the woman be promoted between 25 and 40? Probably only 2 or 3 times. And why is that? She's been in the same talent pool as the man, but she decided to have a family in the meantime. The man also decided to have a family, but for the woman it means skipping promotion steps. Because, and the reason for that is not that the employer is suddenly very evil and says, well, I'm going to throw you out of the talent pool because you're building a family. No, the reason is that we're not ready structuring our companies in a way that we're promoting while you do part-time work. So what is very natural for most women, for most people having families, is they're doing part-time work. And it's still more common, at least in Germany, that the women do more part-time work than men. And this significantly lowers their probabilities of getting promoted, because most jobs at the higher levels, at the leadership levels, are not jobs in part-time. They're only full-time jobs. So in order to get the promotion every 3 years, you need to continue working full-time. And this is one of the major issues you can also tackle through the compensation system. Because the compensation system, how you, for instance, pay part-time and how you pay full-time, of course, massively impacts how people want to do one or the other thing. So the norm right now in Germany is you pay pro rata temporis. If you get 100K a year for a full-time job and you do 70%, you will get 70K.
70K.
If you do 50%, you will get 50K.
50. I'm good in maths.
So yeah, and now imagine, Thomas, we're the guys. If you offer us the same job and say, well, take care of your baby, and you just resume your job with 70% pay, we'd say, well, that's a bad deal. I continue to work 100% and full time. I want to earn 100%. Now imagine if I told you, well, Thomas, but I see men tending to their children is important too for me as a company, and I'll give you not 70%, but I'm going to give you 85% limited to 3 years. Now you probably start thinking, okay, if my wife and I, if we both cut down to 70% or 60%, but we actually get more than the 70%, we get 85%, we would actually, instead of one working 100% and one working 0, we would now get basically more than we earned at full time when we work half time or a significant part-time.
And both could work part-time, for instance, right?
And both could work part-time. Because the answer we're giving to the question, are all the men evil and all the women good, and can we just swap the system around? The first idea is just swapping it around, and that's what I'm seeing from female partner colleagues. They have men who are basically taking on their role, their traditional role, and they're staying at home, and they pursue their careers 100%. But it's still one goes 100, one goes 0, instead of both go part-time. But both will only go part-time, and that's the reason why we can always validate our thesis if it's attractive for men. If it's attractive for men to work part-time, it'll be attractive for women too. We're asking sometimes the wrong questions. We're asking, what do we need to do that women work part-time, or how can we help women? But I think if we turn the question around and say, well, how could we change the behavior of men? How could we incentivize men to work part-time? Women are doing it already. So actually, we don't need to bring more women into part-time work. We need to bring more men into part-time work. So we need to make part-time work more attractive. We probably need to pay more for part-time work, at least for a limited amount of time during childcare. Not forever, but during childcare. And we need to think differently about our promotion system. We probably need to think differently about our bonus system. When we think about the share and the stock option programs, that could also be an incentive. You could say, you work part-time, we will reduce your fixed salary to 70%, but you will get the same amount of shares as the full-time worker. That could also be a great incentive. So you don't lose on the future growth and benefits. You don't lose on your old age pension.
I agree, and I also think that a lot of work is just unnecessarily done. There is so much inefficiencies going on, and I think if you just take out one day and you limit yourself to, you know what, I just take it on as a challenge for a month. Can I do the same work I am expected to do instead of 5 days in 4 days? I am 100% sure you can.
We would, yeah, I always struggle a little bit with this one, because as a lawyer, I'm probably not intelligent enough to do my work in 4 days. When I have clients calling on the Friday.
That's different. That's different then, I would say. But let's say 80% of the jobs, or even more, 95% maybe.
So I think I really like all the new thinking, and we also just need to be very conscious that we don't fall into the trap of having new solutions for everybody. But I totally agree with you, Thomas, that there are jobs where you could apply that thinking. There are also jobs where you could apply that thinking in a way, and we're very traditional in Germany regarding the laws. We need to change our laws, because it would make totally sense in some jobs to do from agile working what we would call sprints and say, let me work 3 days, 12 hours a day, and then I have 2 more days for the family,
Yeah.
and that's how I want it to be. And we're very strict here because we're still from this blue collar working structure from the law system where we, for instance, say in Germany, it's mandatory that you get 11 hours rest between end of work one day and beginning of work the other day. And that's just not, and it's interfering with good habits people are building. So now with home office and mobile working, some companies, they already have a certain amount of time you need to spend within the company, let's say from 10 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But then you're free to go home and tend to your kids and have dinner with the kids. And it is normal that people then go to their laptops at 9 in the evening or 10 in the evening, do 1 or 2 more hours. But when they start at 7 in the morning, it's actually forbidden according to German law. So we need to have a modern law system that's also adding to the new ideas you're saying. Probably for some companies it'll work 4 days a week. Probably for some companies it'll even work 3 days a week. Who knows? For some companies it'll work to work 12 hours a day. For other companies to work 8 hours a day. And
Yeah.
the freedom to find out what works for the different companies, for the different job levels, job descriptions, and also for the people. And also, for instance, when I take a look at my life right now, so I'm a big fan of the Japanese principle Takumi, which basically means you spend a lot of time becoming very good at what you do. So I can say I'm probably now at between 50 or 60,000 hours, work hours into my life. I've been working on average between 2,500 and 3,000 hours a year. And I'm very happy doing that because I really enjoy my work. And it's also because I do what I do. Clients call in crisis, and crisis work always means you work in the evening. You sometimes work on the weekends because the crisis has no good timing and time plan. It's part of the crisis, and when you want to help
Yeah, it's
people,
always ad hoc. Yes.
yeah, when I want to help people, I mean, it's the same with policemen and firefighters. The firefighter can't say, well, it's now 2 o'clock in the morning, the house is burning, that's a bad time. And it's Sundays. Sorry, I'm not working right now. So and it's the same in hospitals, for instance. When you're bleeding, you need a doctor to save your life, and you don't care what time it is. So we need to become more liberal in allowing people in different jobs to just do what they need and what they want to do, and not in sort of imposing sanctions or limits. The huge fear we had in the last century was you're a blue collar worker, you have no power whatsoever, and the employer is enslaving you and is making use of you. You have no say and you're a total victim. This is the old view. The new view is you have a lot of power as an employee. You're clever, you can change companies, you can build your own company. Actually, right now in the employment market, the employer is more dependent on the employee than the other way around. All of my clients have open jobs. All of my clients are hiring, are missing talent, and I've seen statistics that until 2030, it'll get worse every year in Germany. We're missing more and more qualified people, and actually, we can't get enough foreign people into Germany because we also have to distinguish. Of course, we need people with certain qualifications. It's not just get as much refugees in as you can. This is a humanitarian act. We gotta help refugees, but in order for our companies and our job system to function, we actually need qualified people immigrating into our country to help us because we don't have enough German qualified people. That's the truth. That's the
Yeah.
truth. And it's just a
Also for software
complicated picture.
engineers, for instance, for software engineers or salespeople, yeah, there are a lot of people in here who don't speak German but would need to, or maybe don't have to, but it would help.
It would help, and of course, language is a huge issue in the immigration market. We also need to be more flexible there. It might be sufficient if people speak English, because many companies nowadays in Germany are at least prepared to have dual language use. They're probably still speaking German, but they also allow English as a working language, which of course enables more people to come to work. And I mean, it's not only a German problem. I think it's in Austria, it's the same. It's, I don't know about Switzerland, but at least in the European Union, we need to find clever and new ways of allowing people the freedom to work in different ways. And actually, this is adding to ESG, this is adding to diversity. Diversity, apart from men and women, we're very much focused in a diversity picture on just comparing men and women, and it's probably the easiest thing to do. But it also means diversity at the core means we have a lot of different value propositions, a lot of different people doing different things. It's more getting the individual freedom right than a collective system where everybody needs to be the same. And when in politics, in law, when we're not giving enough emphasis and focus on diversity. And my thesis is that we need to allow more individual freedom, that we need to allow more diversity, and this will actually help us build stronger and more resilient companies, and will actually help us in the climate change. And why? Because we need a huge amount of innovation. So here's where the picture comes together for me. We are in a crisis, not only the geopolitical crisis from the Ukraine, but we're in an energy and climate change crisis. Nobody wants to change. Everybody fears the change because it means you are losing your personal comfort. You need to pay extra money for energy. You're probably using the ability to go to holidays, to drive the car you want. So nobody likes the change. We like to talk about the change, but nobody likes to experience the change. On the other hand, it's a huge opportunity. We need to build new technologies. We need green tech. We need new technologies for renewable energy. We need new technologies to come up with certain answers for the future. So we need the innovation. We need people to focus on the innovation, not to focus on their fears. And now bring this together. If we had a more liberal legal system where people are allowed to work like they want, and companies incentivize people according to the future value of the work, giving more shares and stock options, letting people participate in what they create. So we need to harness the innovation. And that's the opportunity we have. When we get the cycle right, when we get people motivated and incentivized to focus on the innovation power, to focus on what they can bring to the table, to promoting them even when they work part-time, then I think we can master the change, because the challenge is the same for everybody. It's not a German challenge or an Austrian challenge or a French challenge. It's a worldwide challenge.
Yes.
That's I think also the huge opportunity we have to create an innovative environment where people can thrive and bring their different strengths to the table.
There's also a book for habits. Um, it's in German. The title is Trotzdem Ja zum Leben sagen of Viktor Frankl. He was a psychotherapist in Auschwitz. So as a former profession, and then he got into Auschwitz and shares his story and perspective, and then you can see how human habits can change like from one day to another when it has to, and hopefully we don't need to get into something severe with the climate change.
It is. I've. It's a very sad book. I've read the book too, and the story of Viktor Frankl. I remember one thing that deeply impressed me, and he said, "Well, the Nazis, they can torture me, they can break my body, they can break my bones, but until the end, I will hang on to how I think about it. Until unless my or as long as my brain is still functioning, I retain the freedom, the attitude to think about how I experience things, how I react to things. And in such grave circumstances, this is, I think, truly remarkable. And he survived, he continued to live. But this very human, there comes another picture to my mind. Do you remember the first encounter of Captain Picard of Starship Enterprise with Q,
No,
a supernatural being?
no.
It is one of the episodes where the starship is threatened to be destroyed by this supernatural being if they don't succumb to the wishes of the supernatural being, which later turns out to be Q. And Captain Picard reaches a decision. He tries everything he can, and they can't beat the supernatural being because he's just too strong, too powerful. And then he sets the ship on self-destruction. And that makes the being release him, because the being discovers it's no fun playing around with humans who will self-destruct when they see no other way around. So the last freedom Captain Picard had was to say, no, I'm not playing your game, I'm ending my life. Which is very drastical, which we see with the old samurai back in Japan, which we see a little bit with Viktor Frankl in a more positive way, framed towards living. But the human ability in grave circumstances to retain a free will, if we not let it come to that climate crisis, when like what we experienced in the Ahrtal in Germany, that was horrible, the floods, all the people and lives. And we don't need this to be like a series with episode 23 coming up next year, and again a flood, and again many people losing their houses and their lives. So yes, the climate change is real, and there are huge calamities around the corner. And in spite of that, we need to group and gather our innovative ideas and do something about it. Not just, and that's our freedom to do. We can choose to be afraid or to just let it happen, or we can choose to do something about it.
Yes, I agree. That would already be some great final words. Do you have anybody else you would recommend to have on the show?
Anybody else to have on the show? Do you have a certain profession you're thinking of, or a certain perspective? I mean, I could definitely recommend my brother, who's now an American. So he was not an American by birth. He was, but since he studies in America, 2015 he became an American. I think he has a quite unique look on Germany and the US. He's working for Morgan Stanley. He's a banker. He's living in Denver with his family, and he's in some ways totally different than me. But I'm pretty sure he has some interesting stories to tell you. So I would recommend my brother René Insam.
Yes. So I think what is interesting for me to build this show further is having these different perspectives, right? It started more from a management, leadership, HR people perspective, but I think also just what we talked about, the whole how does incentivation, remuneration, ESG, and the whole legal system all stick together? I think that's interesting content, and also how certain people really think about the future who have an opinion. That's what I want.
Yeah. And also probably from a when we were talking about the banks and the perspective, a guy I could also dearly recommend to you is Matthias Füssel. He's the head of HR of ING DiBa. So he's also a lawyer, but he also did an MBA at Wharton. So he has a broad perspective, and he's lived part of his life also in Australia. He's also a very interesting guy to talk to.
Yeah, definitely would love to. And you're located mostly in Frankfurt or around Frankfurt?
Yeah, my office is with the German law firm GÖRG in Frankfurt. And Frankfurt is a great city to as kind of a hub to travel around Germany, Europe, and the world, because we have that great airport. I'm a huge fan of the airport, and my Seeheim is about 30 minutes from Frankfurt by car, so it's nearby.
Yeah, I also plan to travel to Frankfurt because I have my main clients are more from Berlin, I would say, but I also have clients in Frankfurt and Munich. So I maybe do a trip soon, and then
Yeah,
maybe I can take you out for lunch.
Absolutely, it'll be my pleasure to take you out for lunch or dinner. So please just send me a message or give me a call, Thomas, and be very great to have you in Frankfurt.
Yes, thank you.